When I was invited to speak over a year ago, I was told that the theme for this year is redemption. And I wasn't sure whether you wanted me to do a deep dive into redemption or not. But I'm not going to do that. What I want to do is introduce you to an American who, in his life, took two views of redemption. And so I've entitled this talk, From Uplift to Redemption. On May 9th of last year, in his inaugural address to the cardinal who had just elected him, Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, warned of practical atheism, the tendency to separate Christianity from ordinary life or give little significance to the redemption accomplished by Jesus on the cross as we go about our day-to-day activity. There was another American who frequently used the term practical atheism in the same context a century and a half earlier. His name was Orestes Brownson. Brownson was born in poverty in rural Vermont, where he was raised Calvinist. He never had more than 6 months of formal education, yet he grew to be one of the most outstanding intellects of the 19th century and perhaps one of the greatest minds America has ever produced. He taught himself French, German, Italian, Latin, and Greek, and never backed down from telling the truth as he saw it, whether it was to criticize Ralph Waldo Emerson or John Henry Newman. In the 1830s, Brownson, he had been born in 1803, so he's 27 now. In the 1830s, Brownson was deeply committed to the American idea of progress. But at that time, most Americans conflated progress with economic advancement, what we now call GDP growth. Brownson defined progress, on the other hand, as creating a society where all men are created equal. His concept of redemption was uplifting of the downtrodden, and he intended to accomplish this through radical social reform. As a Protestant clergyman, he preached universal salvation through education and equality, a kingdom of God on earth. When he found the churches of his time lacking the capacity to achieve this, he turned to politics, believing that the government could instill gospel values into society through legislation. To do this, he joined the leadership of a radical wing of the Democratic Party in order to move the party toward its progressive agenda. Similar to campaign of Bernie Sanders and AOC in the summer of 2023. At this stage, he had every confidence the voice of the people was the voice of God. But he got a rude awakening in the presidential election of 1840, in which his candidate, Martin Van Buren, was defeated by slogans and hard cider. This convinced him that the majority of the American people could easily be duped by public opinion and were not to be counted on to represent the voice of God. The turning point in Brownson's life occurred somewhere between 1842 and 1843. He experienced a profound epiphany when he realized that God is truly free. This in turn altered his concept of providence. He moved away from the common American view of his time, which equated providence with chance, fate, or inexorable general laws. God has written his own law into creation. We discovered that God has written his own laws into creation, human nature, and these are the laws we must all follow. He described this realization as a heavy burden being thrown from his shoulders. In discovering the freedom of God, he understood that God is not bound by nature. Creation and intervention in the world God's creation and intervention in the world are free, voluntary acts of divine love. He also discovered personal relationship with God. He shifted his view of God from a force of nature somewhere out there to a father. He wrote that he leaped to embrace the neck of my father because he was no longer an orphan left to the mercy of anonymous laws of nature. In his account of his conversion, he wrote, I'll never forget the ecstasy of the moment I realized that God is free. This moment of realizing God's freedom was the core of everything he wrote thereafter about politics, science, um, everything that was going on in the 19th century. Although this epiphany, if you will, is almost universally overlooked in the biographies and in commentaries on his work. I've read quite a bit, and I've only, in 5 different books, I've only found reference to this in one footnote. But it's the most important thing, most important experience in his life. He writes 15 years after this event, he says, I'll never forget the ecstasy of the moment I realized that God is free. In the years prior to this epiphany, he had been wrestling with the question of permanence of God, permanence of the gospel message, and progress, the American ideal of permanent improvement, man and world. He saw this, he couldn't reconcile these two concepts. At that time, he regarded Jesus as a providential man, just a man, but raised up by God to a higher life to mediate between God and man by bringing the message of God to man. Following his discovery of God's freedom, Brownson's understanding of Jesus clarified into the Nicene Constantinople Creed, Jesus as true God and true man. In this light, Jesus' profession as carpenter makes him mediator between the permanence of the divine plan for creation as God, the permanence, and progress as the God-man working, participating humanly in improving creation. Brownson concluded that the true progress is being happy with God in heaven, acknowledging that Christ has already redeemed each man, regardless of his earthly situation. However, he was quick to point out that this reality should not lead to passivity. Instead, it urges the laity to seek justice in the world, harmonizing the permanent divine idea of creation with human action. Thus, when Jesus worked, he participated in progress, thereby sanctifying human labor. While Christ was already had already redeemed man, human work and politics are a way to participate in progress by ordering temporal affairs according to the plan of God, to quote Lumen Gentium of the Second Vatican Council. This allowed him to view even secular callings like law, trade, as forms of prayer when performed for the love of God. Now, this realization that God is free strongly affected his politics as a Protestant clergyman, but he was also very, very active in politics. And that eagerness to participate in politics and to make kind of deep dives into political philosophy continued with after his conversion to Catholicism, 1844. But his politics fundamentally shifted from a human-centric progress, as I mentioned before, to a recognition of divine providence in the formation of government, and particularly in the formation of the government of the United States. Last month, we had a conference Orestes at CUA, Orestes Brownson and the Mission of America, and my talk at that conference did a deep dive into his concept of divine providence in the formation of the United States and the Constitution. In his masterwork, The American Republic, written in 1866, at the end of the Civil War, he summarized a number of themes he had been mulling over for a decade. He deemed the U.S. Constitution as not the mere creation of well-meaning men, but as providential, with God acting as the primary cause and the founding fathers as secondary causes. And we're in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there's a lot of commentary on the founders and their influences and stuff like that. 80 or 90 years later, as he's writing, Brownson's writing, he wants to clarify some of the interpretation of the founding that had creeped into American culture, and particularly with his now new Catholic outlook on those documents and that event. In his masterwork, The American Republic, so he emphasized the limited authority of the state, rejecting his former idea that virtue could be instilled by the state, and emphasized the importance of personal virtue, individual responsibility, and conscience. The whole idea of a limited authority of the state, a limited government, was to leave the sense of responsibility to at the individual level, something we've lost considerably since his time. He believed that true human society must reflect the divine society of the ever-adorable Trinity, characterized by unity and diversity, and saw this reflection of the Trinity enshrined in our Constitution. So he was one of the, as he progressed in philosophy, that had led up to this realization that God is free, he was developing a philosophy of communion, so that the human person communes with God, particularly, needs some sort of communication with others, with outside of himself. The first one is God. The second one is other people and society, and the third one is nature, which gets into work and changing, creating, improving creation, its environment, all that stuff. And so this communion with God and this unity and diversity that is the Trinity, he saw that very much reflected in the Constitution itself. And then by viewing the foundational law of the country as a gift from God and the best form of government that Catholics could ask for, he lifted love for America and its Constitution to the level of harmony with the divine idea of creation, which enjoined the virtues of obedience and religion upon all citizens. And the most patriotic, he raised devotion to the Constitution, a patriotic devotion to the Constitution, to almost a supernatural level. And he wrote that Catholics should be the best Americans, asserting that Catholics were uniquely equipped to understand the true character of the U.S. Constitution due to their theology grounded in the freedom of God and the natural law. They had to prove this by being the best and ablest men in the country, winning the victory over non-Catholics through service and sacrifice, ignoring public opinion, and ordering temporal affairs according to the plan of God. Ultimately, politics was no longer a tool for man to build a utopia by his own power, but a means to courageously live one's faith in ordinary life and fulfill the divine command to improve creation. He often described a refusal to do one's share in implementing the divine plan for creation as political atheism on the part of politicians and practical atheism in all other forms of work. Before leaving his politics, it's worthwhile commenting on his views on church and state. In the mid-19th century, Catholics in Europe were wrestling with the aftershocks of the French Revolution, which was based on a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, and which continued to have a big part in what was going on in European politics. And so the Catholics in Europe turned a leery eye on democracy and the American experiment, figuring that democracy in America was the same as democracy in Europe, which was generally anti-Catholic. This bias was imported by most of the American hierarchy who were either born in Europe or were trained there. Brownson saw that the religious freedom afforded by the Constitution left the Catholic Church free to pursue its mission of getting people into heaven and put no obstacle to Catholic laity who would promote justice through legislation. And he wrote a lot about the role of the laity, so I wanted to spend a little time on that. Brownson was a century and a half ahead of his time in his concept of the church. The church was not the hierarchy and religious orders with the laity as subordinate players, as was commonly assumed. He thought in terms of the Second Vatican Council. The mission of the laity is distinct from the mission of the hierarchy. As a convert from Protestantism, he retained a penchant for political activity and just enough of the spirit of every man a priest. That is, God tries to have an intimate relationship with everyone. He was comfortable reconciling the call to holiness with the mission of the laity to go out and build a better world. A world where it's easier to be good, to quote Dorothy Day's mentor, Peter Morin. I wrote a book about Dorothy Day, completely different than Orestes Brownson. All right, so decades before Leo XIII began to develop social teaching in the church, and even more decades before the popes would see any role at all for the laity in the church, Brownson was promoting the laity's engagement with the secular world. He believed that once we acknowledge Christ's redemption, ordinary Catholics are called to a specific type of engagement with the world. He emphasized several key concepts for the laity. Drawing on St. Thomas Aquinas' concept of studiositas, or study, Brownson advocated for a determined effort to seek out the truth of things and a healthy curiosity to know our world in depth. Right now, we're challenged with AI, and many people are quite fearful of what AI is going to do. Something that we need to make this determined effort to seek out the truth of this new thing and steer it in service of mankind. In 1856, Brownson argued for the sanctification of work. He wrote, "Labor, trade, law, medicine, every honest calling can be converted to prayer, is prayer, if performed for the love of God." He didn't do a deep dive into this, but it runs throughout his writing, particularly when he's writing to the Catholic laity. He believed with the fathers of the Second Vatican Council that the specific vocation of the laity was to seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and ordering them according to divine plan. Again, Lumen Gentium. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI was asked how to confront the secularization of Europe. And he responded, "It's normally the creative minorities that determine the future. In that sense, the Catholic Church must understand itself as a creative minority with a legacy of values which are not a thing of the past, but which are very living and relevant force that must be realized, rendered present in the public debate and in our struggle for a true concept of liberty and of peace." Brownson was convinced of this in 1865. Disillusioned by the election of 1840, he had developed a deep distrust for pure democracy. But in our Republican democracy, a creative minority of Catholic laypeople, a Catholic aristocracy, who would not be a monolith with one opinion, but a group of well-formed men and women able to discuss their differences in charity and a common search for truth in every public debate. Orestes Brownson was denounced to the Holy See on 2 occasions. He blamed it on his politics, but it was probably because he was so far ahead of his time. While he faced these denunciations with humility, he remained a profound Catholic thinker who prayed the rosary every night, brought many Protestants into the Catholic Church, and sought to integrate divine realities with the secular. So we are all called to redeem the time, these short years of our earthly existence. Brownson's discovery of redemption through the incarnation, passion, and death of Jesus relieved his anxiety for the plight of the laboring classes, since the true common good, heaven, was open to all. Nevertheless, he urged his fellow laymen to be fully aware that by Christ's sacrifice, we are made sharers in the divine nature. And just as Jesus at Nazareth called to be actively engaged in human affairs. As Americans, we should appreciate Brownson, who praised the U.S. Constitution as a providential gift of God, based on universal principles, that is natural law, and worthy of patriotic devotion, not just a creation of men of their times, but a harmony with the divine idea. Brownson teaches us that we are called to courageously live our faith in ordinary life, whether in politics or any profession, rejecting any hint of practical atheism and treating our daily work as a way to fulfill the divine command to till the garden and keep it. Thank you. I'd love to take some questions. Yeah.
Reconciles this notion of the feminine potential with its the sort of obvious flaw from the beginning, its recognition and preservation of the institution of slavery. How does Brownson think about reconciling?
Brownson is totally against slavery as an offense to human dignity. And he was actually ahead of his Catholic counterparts. I don't know if you know the history, but the Catholic hierarchy in the 1850s, they were not against slavery. And he took some heat for taking a position against slavery. However, he was not an abolitionist, because the abolitionists wanted to take the one moral issue and make it a national issue. And one of the things that Brownson saw as part of the providential aspect was that the United States was a territorial democracy. So within the confines of the United States, you had the states, and which were defined territorially. And there was this opportunity to have unity and diversity, as you referring to Trinity, I mean, the parallel to the Trinity, unity and diversity. And so you had diverse states. You had Massachusetts, which was, an abolition state, if you want, and you had Mississippi. They were all part of the same family, the same organism. And that it was an opportunity to slowly educate the Southern culture away from slavery, but that should go on. But he saw that any force from, say, the North, the abolitionists, against the South was contrary to this idea of unity and diversity, that we had to keep this diversity, and through education or whatever, economics, whatever, that you could get rid of the various defects. But he thought the abolition movement and the factories of the North were just as much of an offense to human dignity as slavery. And in 1840, he wrote an essay called "The Laboring Classes," which he wrote that as a Democrat during the presidential election of Martin Van Buren, and the Whigs, I guess it was Whigs at that time, they used it to campaign against Martin Van Buren, because at that time Brownson had a national reputation, and he kind of represented the Democratic Party in New England. I mean, he was the big spokesman. So he writes this essay, and he lays out all the defects of the capitalist system in the North. And of course, there wasn't any labor legislation at all at that time. And he's saying this is as bad as slavery. It depends on the factory owner or the slave owner, how they deal with people. So so he was willing to have this diversity, kind of territorial democracy, as he called it, and that everybody dealing with each other in some sort of unity would eventually correct the worst parts of the various states, the various cultures. One thing he did have great respect for was the aristocracy in the South, because having been disillusioned by the people, voice of God is voice of the people, voice of God. He thought that we really did need these informed minorities, because he had made no bones about it. The majority of American people are generally going to be duped by public opinion. We see that in modern structure today. So I hope I answered that question. Yes.
You mentioned his connections with the thought of the Second Vatican Council, but I'm wondering who before his time would he have looked to as maybe a leading Catholic thinker? Would it have been Bellarmine or Francis de Sales, or because we hear echoes of in some of his
I know he read Bellarmine and Suarez. I don't know whether he read Francis de Sales. I suppose he did. He been a voracious reader. As he was converting, he was taking a lot of he was reading a lot of French literature, French political thought, and the French writers that he was reading were very often ex-priests who had left the priesthood during the French Revolution or shortly thereafter. They had been overwhelmed by these democratic ideas and the new freedom and all the liberty and all that stuff. So they were writing philosophy, and Brownson, as a Protestant, he was able to pick up that, well, the best ideas in this guy are ideas that come from the Catholic Church, and that where he goes wrong is where he's fallen in with these revolutionists. And gradually that actually brought him the Catholic Church. He didn't know any Catholics, and he hadn't read any serious Catholic tomes until he figured it all out for himself and knocked on the door of the Archbishop of Boston. And he was extreme. He was a national figure at that time. So the Archbishop of Boston was delighted to have him come into the church. But he only began to look at Aristotle, Aquinas, and these after he converted. And so his conversion has a lot to do with his political thought as it matures. And I didn't mention it, but his masterwork, written in 1866, is the American Republic, and it's available in many forms. It's also you can get it on Project Gutenberg as an EPUB. I recommend it strongly. When someone first reads the American Republic, you expect to hear something about America. He doesn't get to America until like chapter 12 or something like that, because he goes into the whole formation of how society is formed, because he's dealing with Locke and Rousseau and the natural, the state of nature. He said, this is ridiculous. There was never any state of nature. So he goes through that and how government forms, and it's quite a work. And then it all culminates in the American Constitution, and kind of he regards it as the best form of government that was ever devised, and because of this divine intervention in the founding. So because it has a divine intervention, because it is a providential gift to mankind, then we have a mission as Catholics to make it work. And writing about the Constitution as it was in 1865, 1866, he says our job is to demonstrate to the rest of the world that this is possible, that we can do this with this territorial democracy, emphasizing personal responsibility. And we've lost a lot of it. Almost every constitutional amendment since then has gone in the direction of the progressivism and giving more power to the federal government. But when he was writing, he saw the Constitution at that time as the best form of government. Yes.
I think it's probably worth noting, second to the Gospels and the Pauline letters, the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution engineered more change in the world since then than any other documents have. Up until within 150 years of those documents being published, slavery had been outlawed in almost every country in the world. The last thing cut out of the world. Up until then, slavery had been an institution, formal institution, every human government for thousands of years. And those documents change that in a way that no other papers have ever. And that's part of the connection between the Gospels and the Constitution, the capacity to change society fundamentally from the bottom up.
Yes.
who was his patron? I mean, he lived 73 years, started in rural Vermont, but over those 73 years, how did he feed himself, clothe himself, find a house? Did he have some type of a profession? Or I know it wasn't from selling books on Amazon, but what? How did he live?
He started as a pastor, and they get donations through
Okay.
through their congregation. But his first parish or church was a working class church in industrial Massachusetts, and so they didn't have any money. He didn't have much money for most of his life. He had 8 children and a wife that for 60 years or something, 50 years. But he started something in in the 1830s called the Boston Quarterly Review, and so he would put out, and this went to a lot of the Protestants. It was very, very influential among the Protestant communities around the country. Of course, the country only went to the Mississippi, but I don't know the circulation, but he had paid subscribers to this quarterly journal where he would write almost everything himself. 250 pages a quarter, all new stuff. And but reading the Boston Quarterly Review, you can pick up the progress of his conversion, and then when he converts, he closes the Boston Quarterly Review. A year later, after he has converted to Catholicism, he begins Brownson's Quarterly Review, and he loses most of his Protestant subscriptions, but he picks up a whole new subscription base, which is Catholics around the country who have, are intellectual and eager to read things that, and he was just he was an outstanding writer, and a lot of people were following him. So they made principal money. But the other thing, in those days, you made a lot of money because once you made a reputation, you made a lot of money just going around and talking to people in communities. They didn't have anything. They didn't have television or radio or anything. They just would pay a dime and go to listen to somebody all night. So he went all over the country giving talks, and he would pack the halls or wherever he was speaking. Sometimes he would get people all pissed off. He was giving an address at Fordham University, and sitting next to him was the Archbishop of New York, who stood up and walked out. He was always having conflicts with the hierarchy because I think he was so far ahead of his time. Yes.
Did he ever write about or have a reaction to the theory of evolution or Charles Darwin's writings? Because
Absolutely.
really the Protestant churches, particularly during the time period, I know the Catholic Church had a much more hands-on reaction and weathered the storm much better than most of the Protestants.
He took him head on. The whole idea of the human race coming from monkeys, he thought that was absurd. He had this phrase, the Gentile apostasy, and so he posited that Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God and were conversing with God, and they had all this knowledge that God had given them. And then they were thrown out with original sin, which clouded their sense of right and wrong. But they didn't lose the knowledge that they had picked up in the garden. And it was only, and they came out as human beings, not as monkeys. They came out as human beings, and it was only after generation and generation that their progeny lost the knowledge that, or it was obscured, that Adam and Eve had left the garden with, because of that, the Gentile apostasy, and so that Christ's redemption is actually, then we have to recover from this Gentile apostasy. I haven't seen that anywhere else, but that's just one little aspect of his confrontation with Darwin, and then the other Herbert Spencer and the others. There were some Episcopalian divines or Anglicans who fell for this Darwin hook, line, and sinker. And he had been through it before, because in his early life as a Protestant, he was pretty sold on this perfectibility of man, and then he would be able to confront all of these books as they came out, because people would look, actually, Catholics, after his conversion, Catholics would look to Brownson to explain what we're dealing with here. And so he was dealing with Darwin, he was dealing with Marx, he was dealing with feminism, he was dealing with temperance movement. There was a temperance movement started in Maine liquor law. He thought that was atrocious. But here you have a defect, and you're legislating for everybody because a couple of people are susceptible to this defect. He said that with that spirit, whether it was intemperance or whether it was abolition, the spirit of personal responsibility atrophies, and you rely on the government to tell you what to do. Again, that's why we're pretty far on that, in that state right now. Yes.
Last question for you. Who is today's Brownson? Do we have any great minds now?
Well, I think it's more diversified. I think in the middle of the 19th century, he was really the only one who, I think he was single-handedly confronting all of these issues as they were coming up. And now you have, people who are doing deep dives into family, into, I don't think anybody's covering the Constitution the way Brownson did, but you have particular issues, and you have experts in that area. But his kind of Renaissance man type persona, I don't think there's anybody out there now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.